On the afternoon of August 2, 216 BC, the scorching sun blazed over the plains of Cannae in southern Italy. But beneath that merciless light, this was no longer a battlefield in any ordinary sense. It had become a sea of the dead. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers lay packed together across the ground. Broken shields, bent spears, and blood-stained swords were buried among the bodies. Standards that had once represented the pride of Rome's legions now lay beneath Carthaginian feet. Officers, senators, aristocrats, and ordinary soldiers had fallen together in a disaster unlike anything the city of Rome had ever witnessed. Only a few hours earlier, the Roman army had been the largest force the Republic had ever assembled on a single battlefield. It outnumbered the enemy by nearly 2 to 1. Its soldiers marched into battle, believing that the strength of 8 legions would crush Hannibal and end the invasion that had shaken the Italian peninsula for 2 years. Now, most of that army no longer existed. The survivors were trapped inside a tightening ring. There was no longer enough room to raise a shield, swing a sword, or even turn around. From the front, both flanks, and the rear, Carthaginian troops pressed inward without pause. The clash of metal, the screams of the wounded, and desperate cries for mercy blended together beneath a thick cloud of dust. Somewhere beyond the encirclement, Hannibal watched the greatest victory of his career move toward completion. He was fighting thousands of kilometers from his homeland, without a reliable supply of reinforcements, while commanding an army made up of many different peoples. Yet at Cannae, he had transformed Rome's greatest advantage, its overwhelming numbers, into the very weapon that destroyed it. How had Hannibal achieved the impossible? How could a smaller army surround and almost completely annihilate the most powerful military force in the Mediterranean world? To understand the answer, we must return to the years before Cannae, when the rivalry between Rome and Carthage began to transform into a struggle for survival. To understand why more than 80,000 Roman soldiers faced Hannibal on the plains of Cannae, we must turn the clock back nearly half a century, to the moment when the 2 greatest powers of the Western Mediterranean began an unavoidable struggle for supremacy. To the south, across the blue waters of the Mediterranean, Carthage had risen into one of the wealthiest trading empires of the ancient world. From its bustling ports in North Africa, Carthaginian merchant ships carried goods to Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and many other distant lands. Its strength did not rest solely on its immense wealth, but also on a powerful navy capable of dominating the most important sea routes of the Mediterranean. Rome, however, had followed a very different path. Rather than becoming a maritime trading empire, it had grown into a land-based military power through relentless conquest. One by one, the cities of the Italian peninsula were either defeated or brought into alliance with the Roman Republic. Every newly acquired territory provided more soldiers, grain, and resources, allowing Rome's legions to grow larger, stronger, and more experienced with each campaign. A clash between these 2 expanding powers was almost inevitable. In 264 BC, the First Punic War erupted over control of the island of Sicily. After more than 20 years of brutal fighting on both land and sea, Carthage was forced to accept defeat. It surrendered Sicily, agreed to pay an enormous indemnity, and soon afterward lost both Sardinia and Corsica to Rome. For many Carthaginians, this was far more than a military defeat. It was a humiliation that demanded revenge. It was during this period of bitterness that the famous Barcid family began rebuilding Carthage's strength in the Iberian Peninsula. Its leader was Hannibal Barca, a seasoned general who believed that only another war could erase the disgrace inflicted by Rome. According to ancient historians, before accompanying his father to Spain, the young Hannibal placed his hand upon an altar and swore that he would forever remain an enemy of Rome. Whether entirely true or partly legendary, this oath perfectly reflected the man Hannibal would become. He grew up among soldiers, learned the art of command through real campaigns, 0.35s, and quickly established himself as Carthage's most gifted military leader. After succeeding his father, and later his brother-in-law in command of the army, Hannibal understood one crucial truth. If Carthage remained on the defensive, it would always stand in Rome's shadow. To change the course of history, he would have to carry the war directly into Italy itself and force Rome to fight not for glory, but for survival. In 218 BC, Hannibal made a decision that many of his contemporaries considered nothing short of madness. Instead of waiting for Rome to invade Spain or North Africa, He chose to carry the war directly into enemy territory. His objective was not to capture a handful of cities, but to strike at the very foundation of Rome's confidence and reputation for invincibility. Departing from New Carthage in the Iberian Peninsula, Hannibal led an army of roughly 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. His forces crossed the Ebro River, marched through southern Gaul, and then turned toward the towering Alps, a natural barrier that the Romans believed no army could cross while carrying its weapons, supplies, and equipment. The march soon became a desperate struggle for survival. Narrow mountain paths and slippery cliffs caused supply wagons to tumble into ravines. Snow covered the trails, rockslides crashed down without warning, and hostile mountain tribes launched repeated ambushes against the long columns winding through the passes. Many soldiers died from freezing temperatures, starvation, or fatal falls into deep gorges. Even the mighty war elephants, symbols of Carthaginian power, gradually perished under the brutal conditions. By the time Hannibal descended into northern Italy, his army had lost nearly half of its original strength. It was a staggering price to pay for what would become one of the boldest military marches in history. Yet the reward was extraordinary. Hannibal had accomplished what Rome had considered impossible. A Carthaginian army now stood on Italian soil. Hannibal understood that he lacked the manpower and siege equipment needed to capture the city of Rome itself. Instead, he embraced a far more ambitious strategy. He would repeatedly defeat Roman armies in open battle, undermine the Republic's prestige, and persuade Rome's Italian allies that the seemingly invincible Republic could, in fact, be beaten. If Rome's alliance system collapsed, so too would the vast reservoir of manpower that sustained its legions. The strategy began to pay off almost immediately. At the Battle of the Ticinus River, Carthaginian cavalry defeated Roman reconnaissance forces, demonstrating their clear superiority on horseback. Soon afterward, at the Battle of the Trebia, Hannibal lured the Romans into crossing an icy river while cold, hungry, and exhausted before unleashing a hidden force against their rear, winning a decisive victory. Less than a year later, at Lake Trasimene, he executed one of the greatest ambushes of the ancient world, virtually destroying an entire Roman army. 3 devastating defeats in rapid succession sent shockwaves throughout Italy. The Romans were beginning to realize that they were not merely facing a talented general, but an opponent capable of turning every familiar rule of warfare into an advantage for himself. After the disaster at Lake Trasimene, panic spread throughout Rome. In less than a year, 2 major Roman armies had been destroyed, 1 consul had been killed, and Hannibal's forces were roaming freely across the Italian peninsula. For the first time in generations, many Romans feared that their own homeland might be in serious danger. In response to the crisis, the Senate appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, granting him nearly absolute authority to save the Republic. Unlike most Roman commanders, Fabius did not believe Hannibal could be defeated in a single decisive battle. He understood that the Carthaginian general consistently turned his enemy's impatience into his greatest advantage. Rather than concentrating his forces for a direct confrontation, Fabius adopted an entirely different strategy. He shadowed Hannibal's movements closely while refusing to fight a major engagement. Roman troops repeatedly destroyed crops, evacuated civilians from areas that Hannibal might occupy, and cut off his supply lines whenever possible. When opportunities arose, they attacked only small foraging parties or isolated detachments separated from the main Carthaginian army. The strategy produced no spectacular victories, but it steadily drained Hannibal's time, supplies, and manpower. With every passing day, the Carthaginian army remained farther from home, while Rome continued to draw fresh soldiers from its vast network of Italian allies. Yet what made perfect military sense proved disastrous politically. Many Roman citizens viewed Fabius as a coward because he refused to give battle. Farms and villages continued to be raided by Hannibal's army, fueling growing public frustration. His critics mockingly gave him the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. By 216 BC, public pressure had reached its breaking point. The Romans no longer wished to wait. They demanded a decisive battle that would erase the humiliation of their previous defeats. This time, they resolved to assemble the largest army in the history of the Roman Republic, convinced that overwhelming numbers would accomplish what every previous commander had failed to achieve. In the summer of 216 BC, the Roman Republic undertook the greatest military mobilization in its history. After suffering 3 consecutive defeats at the hands of Hannibal, the Senate believed the time had come to end the war with a single decisive battle. Instead of dividing its forces to defend multiple regions, as it normally did, Rome concentrated nearly all of its military strength into one massive army. According to ancient sources, this force consisted of 8 Roman legions, supported by an equal number of allied contingents drawn from across the Italian peninsula. Modern estimates generally place its strength at around 80,000 infantry and more than 6,000 cavalry, making it one of the largest armies ever assembled on an ancient battlefield. For the Romans, the strength of a legion had always rested upon discipline and its ability to fight in tightly organized formations. This time, they believed overwhelming numerical superiority would simply crush Hannibal's army, which was nearly half its size. Many assumed that if previous Roman armies had failed because they were too small, then an enormous force would surely achieve the victory that had so far remained elusive. Yet the sheer size of the army also created challenges unlike anything Rome had faced before. Commanding tens of thousands of soldiers on a single battlefield was an extraordinarily difficult task. Delivering orders, maintaining formations, and coordinating different units became increasingly complicated, especially once battle descended into confusion. Leading the army were the Republic's 2 serving consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. Under Roman tradition, supreme command alternated between them every other day. Although intended as a safeguard against concentrating too much power in one individual, this arrangement would prove to be a significant weakness at the most critical moment. Paulus was an experienced commander with a cautious temperament. He fully appreciated how dangerous Hannibal had become after the disasters at the Trebia River and Lake Trasimene. Varro, by contrast, was portrayed by many Roman historians as bold, aggressive, and eager for a decisive engagement. While later accounts may have unfairly placed much of the blame for the coming defeat on Varro, there is little doubt that both public opinion and the Senate demanded the same outcome: destroy Hannibal as quickly as possible. As Rome placed its faith in overwhelming numbers, Hannibal carefully observed every movement of the advancing army. He understood that such a massive force possessed tremendous power, but if it could be drawn into the right trap, that very strength could become its greatest weakness. In early August 216 BC, both armies advanced toward the plains of Cannae in the region of Apulia, southeastern Italy. This was no random location. Cannae served as an important Roman grain depot, storing supplies that helped feed the Republic's armies operating in the area. By seizing the site, Hannibal not only secured provisions for his own troops, but also deliberately provoked Rome into marching south to reclaim it. The battlefield lay near the Aufidus River, known today as the Ofanto River. Most of the surrounding land consisted of a broad, open plain with few hills or forests to obstruct movement. For many commanders, it was an ideal location for a large-scale battle. For Hannibal, however, the terrain offered something even more valuable. The wide open space would allow his cavalry to operate at maximum effectiveness. In previous battles, Carthaginian cavalry had repeatedly demonstrated its superiority over Roman horsemen. Among the most feared were the Numidian cavalry from North Africa, renowned for their speed, mobility, and exceptional skirmishing skills. Riding small but remarkably resilient horses, they carried bundles of light javelins and rarely committed to close combat unless the moment was favorable. Alongside them fought the heavier Iberian and Gallic cavalry, whose powerful charges could shatter enemy formations with devastating force. Hannibal's infantry was equally remarkable. Rather than being a single national army, it was a diverse force composed of Carthaginians, Iberians, Gauls, African veterans, and expert slingers from the Balearic Islands. Each group brought its own weapons, traditions, and methods of fighting. What transformed this collection of different peoples into one of the most formidable armies of the ancient world was Hannibal's extraordinary ability to combine their individual strengths into a single, coordinated fighting force. Facing them, the Romans still possessed a clear numerical advantage. Their legionary infantry was highly disciplined, thoroughly trained, and famous for its endurance in close combat. Their cavalry, however, was significantly outnumbered. More importantly, the enormous size of the Roman army made maneuvering such a vast force across the battlefield far more difficult than many commanders appreciated. Both generals clearly understood the strengths and weaknesses of their armies. The Romans believed that tens of thousands of heavily armed infantrymen would simply overwhelm the enemy through sheer weight and determination. Hannibal saw something entirely different. On the open plains of Cannae, he did not need to be stronger than Rome in every respect. He only needed to persuade the Romans to fight exactly the battle he had already planned for them. As the two armies faced one another on the plains of Cannae, many believed the outcome would be decided by the strength and courage of the soldiers. But for Hannibal, the battle had begun long before the first sword was drawn. He had prepared not only his army, but also the way his enemy would think and react. Hannibal understood the Romans remarkably well. After 3 crushing defeats, they desperately longed for a victory that would restore the honor of the Republic. They placed absolute faith in the power of their legions and believed that a massive frontal assault would inevitably break the Carthaginian line. That confidence would become the very foundation of Hannibal's plan. If he met the Romans head-on in a conventional formation, his smaller infantry force would almost certainly be overwhelmed. Instead of resisting Rome's greatest strength, he chose to exploit it. Every step forward would convince the Romans that victory was within their grasp, while at the same time drawing them deeper into a carefully prepared trap. At the center of his line, Hannibal deployed his Gallic and Iberian infantry. These warriors were brave, experienced, and disciplined enough to withdraw in good order while continuing to fight. Rather than forming a straight battle line, he arranged them in a shallow outward curve that projected slightly toward the Roman army. From a distance, the Carthaginian center appeared ready to absorb the full force of the Roman advance. Meanwhile, his finest troops occupied the wings. The African infantry veterans, hardened by years of campaigning under Hannibal, were heavily equipped, exceptionally disciplined, and positioned slightly behind the center instead of level with it. Their formation resembled 2 open doors waiting to swing shut. Their mission was not to attack immediately, but to wait patiently for exactly the right moment. On the outer flanks stood the force in which Hannibal placed his greatest confidence's cavalry. On the left, near the Aufidus River, were the powerful Iberian and Gallic horsemen under Hasdrubal, renowned for their devastating charges. On the right, the swift Numidian cavalry was tasked with harassing and containing the opposing horsemen, preventing them from influencing the main struggle unfolding in the center. The entire plan depended upon flawless coordination. The center had to give ground without collapsing. The African infantry had to hold their positions until the decisive moment arrived. The cavalry needed to defeat their opponents quickly before returning to the battlefield. If any one part of the plan failed, the entire strategy would unravel. But if everything unfolded exactly as Hannibal intended, the Romans would not realize they were surrounded until every avenue of escape had already disappeared. The most terrifying aspect of the Carthaginian army was not simply its strength, it was the fact that every Roman movement had already been anticipated by the commander who had written the battle's script long before it began. At dawn on August 2nd, 216 BC, as the sun slowly rose above the plains of Cannae, both armies completed their battle formations. The summer air in southern Italy was hot and dry. According to several ancient accounts, a wind blowing from the south carried clouds of fine dust toward the Roman lines, reducing their visibility even before the fighting began. Ahead of them stood Hannibal's army, fully prepared for the confrontation. As was customary in ancient warfare, the light troops opened the battle. Hannibal's Balearic slingers launched stones at remarkable speed and accuracy, while javelin throwers from both armies advanced to harass the opposing formations. The skirmish lasted only a short time before these light troops withdrew, clearing the field for the main forces to collide. On Hannibal's left wing, near the banks of the Aufidus River, Hasdrubal immediately unleashed his Iberian and Gallic cavalry in a fierce assault against the Roman horsemen. The narrow space between the river and the infantry formations left little room to maneuver. The cavalry engagement quickly turned into a brutal close-quarters struggle, with many riders forced to dismount and continue fighting on foot with swords and spears. Superior in both numbers and experience, the Carthaginian cavalry gradually overwhelmed the Romans, driving them from the battlefield. On the opposite flank, the Numidian cavalry pursued a very different mission. Rather than seeking an immediate victory, they repeatedly charged, withdrew, hurled javelins, and changed direction with astonishing speed. Their purpose was not to destroy the Roman allied cavalry, but to keep them occupied long enough for Hasdrubal to finish his work on the other side of the battlefield. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of Roman infantrymen advanced steadily toward the Carthaginian center. Completely confident in their overwhelming numerical superiority, they concentrated their full weight against Hannibal's front line. The sounds of war horns, clashing shields, and striking spears echoed across the plain. At first, everything unfolded exactly as the Romans had hoped. The Gallic and Iberian warriors, at the center of Hannibal's formation, slowly began to give ground under the immense pressure of the advancing legions. Watching the enemy retreat step by step, the Romans became even more convinced that victory was within their grasp. The ranks behind continued to press forward, forcing the entire mass of infantry deeper into the center of the Carthaginian line. None of them realized that this growing confidence was leading them ever deeper into the trap Hannibal had prepared days before the battle. The struggle had only just begun. Yet with every step the Roman army took, the course of history moved exactly where Hannibal intended it to go. At the center of the battlefield, Hannibal's Gallic and Iberian warriors continued to fall back under the immense pressure of the Roman legions. But this was not a rout. They withdrew in an orderly fashion, fighting as they gave ground while maintaining their formation. Hannibal himself, together with his younger brother Mago, remained at the most dangerous point of the line, encouraging the troops and ensuring that the center would hold until the decisive moment paused. 0.6 to the Roman soldiers pressing forward, every sign pointed toward victory. The Carthaginian line was steadily retreating, while the legions maintained the momentum of their advance. Rank after rank continued to push from behind, creating a massive human wedge driving ever deeper into the heart of the battlefield. Amid the cheers of advancing soldiers and the deafening clash of weapons, few realized that their once orderly formation was slowly losing its shape. As the Carthaginian center withdrew, its original outward curve gradually transformed into a concave line. The farther the Romans advanced, the deeper they moved between the enemy's two wings. The battlefield became increasingly crowded. Men in the front struggled to swing their swords or raise their shields, while those behind continued pressing forward, leaving almost no room to maneuver. Many soldiers could no longer see what was happening on either flank. Then Hannibal gave the signal. The African infantry, which had remained slightly behind the center since the beginning of the battle, advanced simultaneously. Well rested and equipped with heavy armor, these veteran troops suddenly pivoted inward by nearly 90 degrees and slammed into both flanks of the packed Roman formation. The attack struck almost simultaneously on each side, catching the legions completely by surprise. Within minutes, the entire battle changed. What had begun as an offensive designed to break through the Carthaginian center became a desperate fight for survival. The Romans attempted to turn and face the new threats on their flanks, but it was nearly impossible. Tens of thousands of men were compressed into an increasingly confined space. Officers struggled to communicate their orders, and the coordination that had always been the hallmark of the Roman legions began to collapse. Meanwhile, behind the battlefield, Hasdrubal had completed his mission. After routing the Roman cavalry on the left wing, he quickly led his horsemen across the rear of the battlefield to assist the Numidian cavalry. Together, the Carthaginian cavalry drove off the remaining Roman allied horsemen before wheeling around toward the rear of the Roman infantry. This was the decisive moment of the Battle of Cannae. To the front, the Gallic and Iberian infantry continued to hold the Romans in place. On both sides, the African veterans steadily tightened their grip. Then, from behind, the Carthaginian cavalry suddenly appeared, sealing off every possible route of escape. For the first time that day, the Roman soldiers began to understand the terrible reality before them. They were no longer an army on the attack. They had become an army completely surrounded. Hannibal's trap built upon a carefully controlled retreat and flawless coordination between infantry and cavalry had finally closed. On the plains of Cannae, one of the most brilliant tactical encirclements in military history had just been brought to perfection. Once the encirclement was fully sealed, the Battle of Cannae ceased to resemble a conventional battle. It became a prolonged massacre, with tens of thousands of Roman soldiers trapped inside a shrinking space from which there was virtually no escape. Unlike previous battles, where a defeated army could retreat and regroup, Cannae offered no such possibility. To the front, the Gallic and Iberian warriors continued to hold the Romans in place. On both flanks, the African infantry steadily pressed inward. Behind them, the Carthaginian cavalry had completed the encirclement. The Roman army was now confined within an enormous pocket that grew smaller with every passing minute. Inside this mass of tightly packed men, Rome's numerical superiority disappeared completely. The ranks behind unintentionally continued pushing those in front closer to the enemy's blades. Many legionaries no longer had enough room to use their gladius effectively, a weapon designed for disciplined close-order combat. Some could do little more than raise their shields in defense, while others could not even turn to face attackers striking from both sides. The triumphant cries of the Carthaginians mixed with desperate pleas for help, the clash of steel, and the blaring of war horns. Dust filled the air, reducing visibility to only a few steps. As one line of Roman soldiers fell, those behind were immediately forced forward to replace them, turning the battle into a relentless cycle from which there was no escape. Amid the chaos, many of Rome's senior commanders fell one after another. Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who had opposed fighting Hannibal on the plains of Cannae, was mortally wounded and died alongside his soldiers. Dozens of experienced officers, senators, and magistrates also perished and would never return to Rome. Only Gaius Terentius Varro, accompanied by a small group of cavalry and scattered survivors, managed to break free and escape the battlefield. Ancient historians recorded different casualty figures, but they all agreed on one point. Cannae was among the bloodiest defeats in Roman history. Polybius estimated that around 70,000 Romans and their allies were killed, while Livy reported a somewhat lower number. Most modern historians estimate that between 50,000 and 60,000 Roman soldiers died in a single day, with thousands more taken prisoner. For Hannibal, it was the masterpiece of his military career. For Rome, it was the day an entire generation of warriors was nearly wiped out on a single battlefield. Never before in the history of the Roman Republic had such a massive army been destroyed so completely within only a few hours of combat. When the first survivors returned to Rome, they brought no report of victory, only news of the greatest military disaster in the history of the Republic. At first, few could believe that such an enormous army had been destroyed in a single day. But as more survivors arrived, the terrible truth became impossible to deny. Fear spread rapidly throughout the city. Families flooded the streets searching for news of fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers. The lists of the dead grew longer by the hour, while the number of returning soldiers remained painfully small. Entire households lost multiple family members, as it was common for several generations of the same family to serve in the army. A deep sense of grief settled over Rome. Yet an even greater fear haunted the population. Would Hannibal march directly on Rome? After his overwhelming victory at Cannae, the road to the capital seemed almost completely open. No major Roman field army remained to stand between Hannibal and the city itself. Rumors that the Carthaginian army would soon appear outside Rome's walls spread quickly, intensifying the panic. Remarkably, however, the Roman government did not collapse. The Senate acted with extraordinary speed, introducing a series of emergency measures to preserve order. The city's defenses were reinforced. Additional guards were stationed at the gates, and public displays of mourning were restricted to prevent despair from spreading among the population. Rome understood that if fear took control of the city, Hannibal could achieve victory without launching another attack. The Republic immediately began mobilizing every remaining resource. Young men below the usual military age were called into service earlier than normal. Slaves were purchased by the state and promised their freedom in exchange for military service. Weapons were forged day and night, and new units were organized as quickly as possible to defend Roman territory. Most importantly, the Senate rejected every suggestion of surrender or negotiations for peace. To the Romans, the catastrophe at Cannae was a devastating blow, but it was not the end. Instead of yielding, they chose to prepare for an even longer and more difficult struggle, determined that the Republic would survive, no matter what price had to be paid. Following his overwhelming victory at Cannae, One question has been debated for more than 2,000 years. If Hannibal had just destroyed the largest Roman army ever assembled, why did he not march directly on Rome and end the war? According to a famous story recorded by the Roman historian Livy, Hannibal's cavalry commander Hannibal urged him to advance immediately after the battle. He is said to have declared, "In 5 days, you shall feast in victory on the capital." When Hannibal refused, Hannibal reportedly replied with one of history's most famous military criticisms: "The gods have not granted all gifts to one man. You know how to win a victory, but not how to use it." Many modern historians, however, believe this conversation may have been added long after the events themselves, serving more as a moral lesson than as a reliable historical account. Whether Hannibal actually spoke those words or not, the reality facing Hannibal was far more complicated. His army had just fought one of the bloodiest battles of the ancient world. Although victorious, it had also suffered significant losses, particularly among the Gallic and Iberian infantry that had formed the center of his battle line. His soldiers needed rest, the wounded required treatment, and the battlefield had to be cleared of prisoners and spoils. More importantly, Hannibal possessed no heavy siege equipment capable of breaching the formidable walls of Rome. Even if he had reached the city, capturing Rome would have been an extraordinarily difficult undertaking. Its strong fortifications, local defenders, and remaining military forces would have presented enormous obstacles. At the same time, Hannibal was operating deep inside enemy territory, thousands of kilometers from Carthage, without a reliable system of reinforcements or supplies. Rather than risking everything in a dangerous siege, Hannibal chose to pursue his original strategy. He believed that the victory at Cannae would convince Rome's Italian allies that the Republic was no longer invincible. Indeed, several important cities, including Capua, switched sides, while Syracuse in Sicily and the Kingdom of Macedon also sought closer cooperation with Carthage. What Hannibal underestimated, however, was the resilience of Rome's alliance system. Most of its key allies remained loyal to the Republic. Rome refused to surrender, refused to negotiate, and refused to abandon the war. It was this extraordinary determination that prevented Hannibal's greatest battlefield triumph from becoming the decisive victory of the entire conflict. After Cannae, Hannibal reached the height of his fame. 0.6. Several cities in southern Italy abandoned Rome and joined the Carthaginian cause, most notably Capua, the second largest city on the Italian peninsula at the time. To many observers, the collapse of the Roman Republic seemed only a matter of time. Yet Rome proved that its greatest strength extended far beyond the battlefield. Instead of seeking another decisive engagement, Roman leaders returned to the strategy first advocated by Fabius Maximus. They avoided major battles with Hannibal, disrupted his supply lines, attacked Carthage's allies, and gradually recaptured the cities that had changed sides. Meanwhile, Hannibal became increasingly isolated. His victories were never matched by sufficient reinforcements from Carthage. After years of continuous campaigning in Italy, his army slowly weakened, while Rome continued raising new legions to replace its losses. The true turning point came when a young Roman commander, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, launched successful campaigns in Spain before carrying the war directly into North Africa. Faced with the threat to Carthage itself, the Carthaginian government had no choice but to recall Hannibal after nearly 15 years of campaigning in Italy. In 202 BC, at the Battle of Zama, Hannibal suffered his first decisive defeat. Scipio emerged victorious, and the Second Punic War ended with Rome as the ultimate winner. It remains one of history's greatest ironies. Hannibal achieved what many consider the most brilliant tactical victory of the ancient world at Cannae. Yet, it was Rome that ultimately emerged victorious in the war itself. More than 2,000 years have passed since the Battle of Cannae. Yet Hannibal's name and his victory continue to be studied in military academies around the world. It is remembered not simply because of the scale of the battle, but because of the extraordinary way in which he defeated a much larger army through the masterful combination of tactics, terrain, psychology, and leadership. The double envelopment maneuver executed at Cannae has become one of the defining examples of military art. Generations of commanders and military thinkers, from Frederick the Great and Napoleon Bonaparte to Helmuth von Moltke and modern strategic scholarship, examined the battle to understand how a smaller force could annihilate an enemy with overwhelming numerical superiority. Even in the 20th century, Cannae continued to influence modern military doctrine. The principles of encirclement, isolation, and destruction of enemy forces have appeared repeatedly in military campaigns. Despite the dramatic transformation of weapons, technology, and the nature of warfare since antiquity, yet Cannae offers lessons far beyond the battlefield. It demonstrates that even the most brilliant tactical victory does not necessarily determine the outcome of an entire war. Hannibal achieved an almost flawless battlefield triumph, but Rome ultimately prevailed through its resilience, vast manpower, political stability, and unwavering determination to continue fighting. Perhaps that is why Cannae remains one of the most studied battles in history. It is not only the story of a military genius, but also the story of the limits of genius when confronted by a nation with extraordinary endurance. That contrast has ensured Cannae's place as one of the most influential and enduring battles in the history of human civilization. The Battle of Cannae was more than just Hannibal's greatest victory. It proved that intelligence, patience, and meticulous planning could overcome an opponent with overwhelming numerical superiority. In just a few hours, the Carthaginian commander created a military masterpiece that, more than 2,000 years later, is still studied and taught in military academies around the world. Yet history also offers another lesson that is just as powerful. No matter how brilliant a battlefield victory may be, it does not always decide the outcome of an entire war. Rome lost tens of thousands of soldiers at Cannae, but it never lost its determination. Through resilience, an extraordinary ability to recover, and an unwavering refusal to surrender, the Roman Republic rose from what seemed like certain disaster and eventually became the greatest empire of the ancient world. Perhaps that is why Cannae remains one of the most remarkable battles in history. It is not only the story of Hannibal's military genius, but also the story of Rome's incredible endurance. Two rivals, two very different paths, yet both left an unforgettable mark on human history. Now we'd love to hear your thoughts. If Hannibal had marched directly on Rome after his victory at Cannae, do you think he could have ended the Second Punic War and changed the course of world history? Share your opinion in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see different perspectives on one of history's greatest what-if questions. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to see more videos about ancient Rome, Hannibal, legendary battles, and military history, please like this video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our future documentaries. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you again in the next journey through history.